The spring rain fell in silver sheets against the windows of Graves Manor, a melancholy accompaniment to the scene unfolding in the drawing-room where Lady Juliana Graves sat in her customary corner, nearly invisible behind the arrangement of dried flowers that had not been refreshed in months. At 23, she had perfected the art of disappearing, of folding herself into spaces so small that her family's gaze simply passed over her like water around a stone. Her older sisters, the celebrated beauties Lucinda and Vivienne, occupied the room's centre, their voices rising in increasingly hysterical pitches as they confronted their parents with the news that had arrived that morning. "I will not do it," Lucinda declared, her golden ringlets trembling with indignation. "I would rather enter a convent than marry that monster. They say his face is a ruin, that he frightens children in the street. The Duke of Huntington is one of the wealthiest men in England," their father Baron Graves replied wearily, though his voice lacked conviction. "His offer is exceedingly generous, considering our circumstances." Those circumstances, as Juliana well knew, were dire indeed. Her father's gambling debts had mounted over the years until the family now teetered on the precipice of complete ruin. The creditors circled like vultures, and only the Duke's unexpected offer of marriage to one of the Graves' daughters stood between them and utter disgrace. "Then let Vivienne go," Lucinda snapped, turning on her younger sister. "She has fewer prospects anyway." Vivienne's lovely face contorted with fury. "My prospects are 1,000 times better than being shackled to a scarred beast who hides away in that crumbling estate of his. Lord Pembury has all but declared himself. I will not sacrifice my future happiness for father's mistakes." "Girls, please," their mother interjected, wringing her hands. "Perhaps if we wrote to the Duke, explain that our daughters are delicate creatures who require gentle handling." "He specifically requested a bride of the Graves family," Baron Graves interrupted. "His letter was quite clear. One daughter, any daughter, in exchange for the complete settlement of our debts and a generous allowance for the family going forward." The emphasis on any daughter caused a momentary silence. Then, as one, the family's attention shifted to the corner where Juliana sat frozen behind the dried flowers, a book of poetry forgotten in her lap. "Juliana," her mother breathed, as though the name itself were a revelation. "Of course, Juliana." The youngest Graves' daughter had long since accepted her place in the family hierarchy, where Lucinda possessed golden beauty and vivacious charm, where Vivienne commanded attention with her dark elegance and sharp wit. Juliana was simply there, a quiet presence with unremarkable brown hair and eyes the colour of rain. She had never been presented at court, never had a season, never been considered marriageable material worth the investment of new gowns and introductions. "It's perfect," Lucinda said, relief flooding her features. "No one will miss her at parties. She has no suitors to disappoint. And honestly, Juliana, you should be grateful for any offer at all, given your situation." Juliana's fingers tightened on the book of poetry, her knuckles whitening. She knew she should feel something, outrage perhaps, or despair at being bartered away to a man rumoured to be a monster. Instead, she felt only a strange, hollow calm. "What exactly is the Duke's situation?" she heard herself ask, her voice steady. "Why does he seek a bride in this manner?" Her father shifted uncomfortably. "He was a war hero, decorated for valour at Waterloo. But he sustained grievous injuries during the campaign. They say the scars are quite disfiguring, and his temperament has become reclusive and difficult. He has not appeared in society for nearly 5 years. He probably wants a wife who won't run screaming from his bed," Vivienne added with casual cruelty. "Someone too plain and desperate to have other options. Someone like you, Juliana." The words should have hurt. Once, perhaps, they would have. But Juliana had spent 23 years being overlooked, dismissed, and reminded of her inadequacy. She had built walls within herself, quiet fortifications that allowed her to endure her family's casual cruelties without breaking. "Very well," she said, closing her book and rising from her chair. "I will marry the Duke of Huntington." The shocked silence that followed was almost gratifying. Lucinda recovered first. "You will? Just like that? No tears, no dramatics?" "What would be the purpose of dramatics?" Juliana replied calmly. "As you have pointed out, I have no other prospects, and the family's. Survival depends on this match. It seems a straightforward enough calculation." Her mother dabbed at eyes that had not actually produced tears. "My brave, selfless girl. You are saving us all." Juliana did not point out that bravery and selflessness had nothing to do with it. She was simply making the only choice available to a woman in her position, trading one form of invisibility for another. At least as a duchess, she might have a library to herself and the freedom to be forgotten in more comfortable surroundings. The wedding took place 3 weeks later in the small chapel at Huntington, the Duke's vast and somewhat forbidding estate in the wilds of Northumberland. Juliana arrived in a hired carriage, accompanied only by a maid who had been engaged specifically for the journey, as the family could not spare any of their own servants for such a distance. The estate itself was not the crumbling ruin Juliana had expected. The house was massive and Gothic, yes, with towers and battlements that spoke of medieval origins. But it was also clearly well maintained, its grounds manicured, its windows gleaming in the pale spring sunlight. Inside, she found evidence of wealth and taste that surprised her. Fine furnishings, extensive collections of art and books, and a staff that moved with quiet efficiency. But of the Duke himself she saw nothing until the moment she stood at the altar. He emerged from a side door, accompanied by a single witness, a stern-faced man who was introduced as his solicitor. The Duke of Huntington, Ellis Vane, was tall and broad-shouldered, his military bearing still evident in the rigid line of his spine. He wore a mask that covered the left side of his face, from brow to jaw, the dark leather stark against his pale skin. The right side of his face was handsome in an austere way, with a strong jaw, a well-shaped mouth, and an eye of such dark blue it appeared almost black in the chapel's dim light. That single visible eye fixed upon Juliana with an intensity that made her breath catch. She had expected disgust, or perhaps indifference. Instead, she found something that looked almost like curiosity, as though she were a puzzle he had not anticipated having to solve. The ceremony was brief and perfunctory. Juliana spoke her vows in a clear, steady voice, and if her hand trembled slightly when the Duke slid the ring onto her finger, she hoped he did not notice. His own vows were delivered in a deep voice, roughened by what might have been disuse or damage, she could not tell which. When it was done, when they were pronounced man and wife, the Duke did not attempt to kiss her. He merely offered his arm with stiff formality and led her from the chapel into the great house that was now her home. "You must be fatigued from your journey," he said, the first words he had spoken to her directly. "Mrs. Blackwood, the housekeeper, will show you to your rooms. We dine at 7. And then he was gone, disappearing into the depths of the house with a speed that suggested he found her presence uncomfortable. Juliana stood in the grand entrance hall, surrounded by portraits of stern-faced ancestors, and felt the enormity of what she had done settle over her like a shroud. She was married. She was a duchess. And her husband, it seemed, had no more interest in her company than her own family ever had. The rooms to which Mrs. Blackwood led her were surprisingly beautiful. A suite of chambers decorated in soft blues and creams that felt more welcoming than anything Juliana had known at Graves Manor. French doors opened onto a private balcony overlooking the gardens, and a small sitting room connected her bedchamber to what Mrs. Blackwood described as the Duchess's private study, complete with a well-stocked bookshelf. His Grace had the rooms prepared especially, the housekeeper said, and there was something in her tone, a watchfulness, that made Juliana think she was being measured somehow. He asked what your interests were and was told you are fond of reading. He asked? Juliana repeated, surprised. Who told him? I'm sure I couldn't say, Your Grace. Will you require anything before dinner? Left alone, Juliana explored her new domain with a mixture of wonder and suspicion. Someone had taken considerable care with these rooms. The books on the shelves were not random selections, but a curated collection of poetry, novels, and natural history that aligned remarkably well with her actual interests. Fresh flowers filled vases on every surface, and a writing desk had been stocked with fine paper, ink, and quills. It was the first time in her life that anyone had prepared a space specifically for her comfort. The realization brought an unexpected sting of tears to her eyes, which she blinked away, impatiently. Dinner that evening was a strange affair. The dining room was vast enough to seat 40, yet only 2 places were set, at opposite ends of a table so long that conversation would require shouting. The Duke appeared promptly at 7, still wearing his mask, and took his seat without offering any greeting beyond a curt nod. They ate in silence, course after course of excellently prepared food that Juliana barely tasted. The distance between them seemed deliberate, a barrier as impenetrable as the leather mask that hid half his face. Finally, as the dessert course was cleared, Juliana gathered her courage. Your Grace, she called down the length of the table, might I inquire whether we are to dine in this manner always, or only when you wish to ensure I cannot hear anything you might say? The visible half of the Duke's face registered something that might have been surprise. His dark blue eye studied her for a long moment before he responded. The arrangement seemed practical. I was informed that you are shy and prefer solitude. Informed by whom? Juliana asked, genuinely curious now. Your family was quite detailed in their description of your temperament. They suggested you would prefer to be left alone as much as possible. A cold knot formed in Juliana's stomach. Of course, her family had described her thus. It was how they saw her, the quiet one, the invisible one, the daughter who never caused trouble because she never demanded anything at all. I see, she said carefully. And what else did my family tell you about me? The Duke was silent for a moment. Then, to her surprise, he rose from his chair and walked the length of the table until he stood just a few feet away. Up close, she could see that the visible half of his face bore its own scars, thin white lines that traced across his cheek and jaw like a map of old suffering. They said you were plain, biddable and grateful for any attention, he said bluntly. That you had no accomplishments worth mentioning, no opinions worth hearing, and no expectations worth considering. In short, they described a woman who would be content to exist quietly in a corner of my life without requiring anything of me but a roof and regular meals. His single visible eye held hers with an intensity that made it difficult to breathe. Tell me, madam, were they correct in their assessment? Juliana felt something shift inside her, some long dormant flame flickering to life beneath the layers of resignation she had wrapped around herself. Here was a man who had been lied to as surely as she had, told he was acquiring a cipher, a nothing, a woman so diminished she would scarcely register as human. The anger she felt was not for herself exactly, but for the injustice of it, for both of them. No, Your Grace, she said quietly, holding his gaze. They were not correct. They have never been correct about anything concerning me because they have never troubled themselves to look closely enough to form an accurate opinion. The Duke studied her face for a long, searching moment. Then, slowly, something shifted in his expression, the harsh line of his mouth softening almost imperceptibly. Then, perhaps, he said, we have both been deceived. And perhaps we should begin again, without the expectations others have thrust upon us. He pulled out the chair beside his own and gestured for her to sit. It was not a command but an invitation, the first genuine gesture of welcome she had received since arriving at Huntington. Juliana rose from her distant seat and walked the length of that absurd table to take the chair he offered. Up close, she could see beyond the mask to the man himself, could read the tension in his shoulders, the uncertainty in the set of his jaw. He was as unsure of this situation as she was, she realized. Beneath the ducal authority and the intimidating scars, he was simply a man who had been alone too long. "I am Juliana," she said, offering her hand, "and I should very much like to know who you truly are, rather than who rumour and my family have painted you to be." He took her hand in his grip gentle despite the strength she sensed in his fingers. "Ellis," he replied, "and I find myself equally curious about the woman behind the portrait your family painted." It was not much, this exchange of names and tentative interest, but as Juliana looked into that single dark blue eye and saw something there that might have been hope, she felt for the first time that perhaps this marriage of convenience might become something more, that perhaps two people who had been dismissed and forgotten by the world might find in each other something worth remembering. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that Juliana found surprisingly comfortable. Ellis, as she had come to think of him in the privacy of her own mind, proved to be an unexpectedly considerate host. He made no demands upon her person, treating her with a formal courtesy that gradually warmed into something approaching companionship. They began taking their meals together at the smaller table in the breakfast room, where conversation was possible, and slowly, haltingly, they began to learn one another. She discovered that he was a voracious reader, particularly of classical literature and military history, and that he could argue philosophy with a precision that delighted her. He discovered that she possessed a sharp wit she had learned to hide from a family who found cleverness in a woman distasteful, and that she had taught herself Italian from books in order to read Dante in the original. "You are nothing like they described," Ellis said one evening as they sat together in the library, a fire crackling in the hearth against the spring chill that still lingered in the northern county. "It's as though they sent me an entirely different person than the one they promised." "They described the woman they wished me to be," Juliana replied, not looking up from her book. "Or rather, the woman they assumed I was because they never bothered to look closer. It is easier to dismiss someone as beneath notice when you convince yourself they have nothing worth noticing." She felt his gaze upon her and raised her eyes to meet his. In the firelight, the leather of his mask gleamed darkly, but she had long since stopped seeing it as a barrier. It was simply part of him, as much as his deep voice or his rare, reluctant smile. "Why did you agree to marry me?" he asked quietly. "And I do not mean the practical reasons. I know about your father's debts and your family's situation. I mean why you specifically. Your sisters refused. You must have known you could refuse as well." Juliana considered the question carefully. "Because I had nothing to lose," she said finally. "No suitors to disappoint, no future to sacrifice, no place in society to surrender. My sisters refused because they believed they deserved better. I accepted because I knew that any change, even a frightening one, would be preferable to remaining invisible in a house where I had never truly been seen." Ellis was silent for a long moment. Then he rose from his chair and crossed to the window, his back to her as he gazed out at the darkening grounds. "Do you know why I sought a bride in such an unconventional manner?" he asked. "Because you knew that any woman who would accept such terms would be desperate enough not to expect romance or affection," Juliana replied honestly. "You wanted a transaction, not a marriage." "Partly," he admitted. "But also because I knew that any woman who came to me through normal channels would arrive expecting a certain kind of husband, a whole man, unscarred, capable of playing the role society demands. I cannot be that man, Juliana. The war took that possibility from me." He turned to face her, and she saw that his hand had risen unconsciously to touch the edge of his mask. "They do not know your family, the full extent of my injuries. The mask hides the worst of it, but underneath—" He stopped, his jaw tightening. "I am not fit for polite society. I am not fit for a wife's tender sensibilities. I thought, if I found someone already resigned to a loveless match, at least I would not have to witness her disappointment when she learned the truth." Juliana set aside her book and rose, crossing the room to stand before him. Up close, she could see the tension in the set of his shoulders, the defensive brace in his posture as though he expected her to recoil. "May I see?" she asked softly. His visible eye widened. "You do not know what you are asking." "I am asking to see my husband's face," she replied steadily. "All of it. If we are to be partners in this marriage, even an unconventional one, I would rather know you completely than have this barrier between us forever." For a long moment, Ellis did not move. The fire crackled, the wind murmured against the window panes. Then, slowly, his hands rose to the ties that secured the mask in place. The leather fell away. Juliana did not gasp, did not flinch, though the damage was indeed severe. The left side of his face had been ravaged by what must have been fire and shrapnel together, a landscape of twisted scarring that drew his eye into a permanent squint and pulled at the corner of his mouth. The ear on that side was largely gone, and the scars extended down his neck to disappear beneath his collar. "This is what remains of the Duke of Huntington," Ellis said, his voice harsh with suppressed emotion. "This is what your family traded you for. Do you still wish to see me clearly, madam, or shall I replace the mask and spare you further?" "Ellis," Juliana interrupted, her voice firm. "Be quiet." His mouth closed abruptly, surprise flickering in both eyes now that she could see them both. She reached up, and though she saw him brace himself for revulsion, she merely laid her palm against his scarred cheek, feeling the uneven terrain of damaged skin beneath her fingers. "You asked me why I agreed to this marriage," she said softly. "I told you it was because I had nothing to lose, but that was not entirely true. I agreed because somewhere, beneath the resignation and the acceptance of my fate, I hoped that in a new place, with a new name, I might finally have the chance to be something more than the invisible youngest daughter. I hoped I might find someone who would see me, truly see me, for who I am rather than who my family decided I should be." Her thumb traced gently along the ridge of scar tissue that marked his cheekbone. "You have given me that, Ellis. You have listened when I speak. You have valued my opinions. You have treated me with more consideration in 2 months than my family showed me in 23 years. Why should I recoil from the face of the man who has been kinder to me than anyone I have ever known?" Ellis stood absolutely still beneath her touch, scarcely breathing. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with something she could not immediately identify. "You are remarkable," he said, "and your family are fools of the highest order." "On that, at least, we are in complete agreement," Juliana replied, and was rewarded with a startled huff of laughter that transformed his scarred features into something approaching warmth. In the weeks that followed, something fundamental shifted between them. Ellis began appearing without his mask in her presence, at first hesitantly, then with growing confidence as he realized she truly did not flinch from his appearance. Their conversations deepened, ranging from literature to politics to memories of childhood, his happy and privileged until the war, hers constrained and lonely, despite material comfort. She learned that he had nightmares, that he sometimes walked the corridors at night when sleep would not come, that the sound of fireworks or sudden loud noises could send him spiraling into dark memories of cannon fire and screaming men. She began leaving her door slightly ajar at night, and more than once woke to find him sitting in the chair beside her bed, taking comfort from her sleeping presence without wishing to disturb her. "You should not have to manage this alone," she told him one morning after a particularly difficult night. There is no shame in wounds that do not show, Ellis. The mind can be injured as surely as the body. He looked at her with something approaching wonder. You are the first person who has not told me simply to put it behind me and move forward. That advice is given by people who have never been truly broken, Juliana replied. Anyone who has known real damage understands that healing is not a straight line forward. It is a labyrinth, and sometimes you must go backward or sideways before you can advance. Ellis reached across the breakfast table and took her hand, an increasingly common gesture that still sent a flutter through her chest. How did you become so wise in the ways of suffering? By surviving a family who considered me invisible, she said simply. By learning that my worth did not depend on their willingness to see it. By building walls within myself that allowed me to endure without breaking entirely. They are not such different skills from those required to survive a war, I think. The battlefield was simply different. His grip on her hand tightened. I am glad you survived, he said quietly. I am glad fate brought you to me, even through such mercenary means. I cannot imagine this house without you now, Juliana. I cannot imagine my life without you. The words hung in the air between them, weighted with significance neither had yet dared to name. Juliana felt her heart quicken, felt the warmth spreading through her chest that she had been trying not to acknowledge for weeks now. She was falling in love with her husband. The realization should have terrified her. Instead, it felt like coming home. Before she could formulate a response, the butler appeared in the doorway with an expression of barely concealed alarm. Your Graces, there is a carriage approaching. It bears the Graves family crest. Juliana felt her blood chill. My family is here? So it would appear, Your Grace. Ellis's scarred face hardened into an expression she had never seen directed at her, cold and ducal and forbidding. We will receive them in the blue drawing room, he said, rising. From the table. Together, if you are willing. Juliana took his offered arm, drawing strength from his solid presence beside her. I am willing. The blue drawing room was a formal space they rarely used, and Ellis had clearly chosen it deliberately to receive her family amid grandeur that would remind them of their reduced circumstances. Juliana had barely had time to compose herself before the doors opened, and her mother, father, and both sisters swept into the room with all the theatrical energy she remembered. My darling girl, Lady Graves exclaimed, sweeping forward with arms extended. How we have missed you. You cannot imagine the agony of these weeks, not knowing how you fared, whether you were well treated. She stopped abruptly as Ellis emerged from the shadows where he had been standing, his face fully visible, his scars on display. The colour drained from Lady Graves's face. Lucinda let out a small shriek. Vivian's hand flew to her mouth to stifle what might have been a gag. Baron Graves simply stared, his expression a mixture of horror and what Juliana recognised as calculation, as he revised his assessment of exactly what he had sold his daughter into. Good morning, Ellis said, his voice pleasant but carrying an edge of steel. How kind of you to visit your daughter. I do hope you have not found the journey too taxing. Your Grace, Baron Graves managed, executing a bow that was somewhat hampered by his inability to tear his gaze from Ellis's face. We wish to assure ourselves of Juliana's well-being and to see how she has settled into her new role. How I have settled, Juliana repeated, her voice cool. You mean you wish to see whether I was sufficiently miserable to provide entertainment, or whether the Duke's fortune might extend to additional handouts for the family? The blunt words produced a shocked silence. Lucinda recovered first, her beautiful face arranging itself into an expression of wounded virtue. Juliana, how can you speak to your own mother so cruelly? We have been beside ourselves with worry. We only want to know that you are happy. Happy? Juliana echoed. You want to know if I am happy? Tell me, Lucinda, at what point in the past 23 years have you ever concerned yourself with my happiness? When you took the dress Mother had made for my 15th birthday because it suited your colouring better? When you forgot to mention I was invited to the Marchioness's garden party until the day after it occurred? When you told Lord Wrexham that I had a nervous condition that made me unsuitable for dancing because you wanted his attention for yourself? Each accusation landed like a blow, and Juliana found herself drawing strength from the expression of dawning approval on Ellis's scarred face. She had spent her life being silent, accommodating, invisible. She would not be silent now. You sold me to a stranger, she continued, her voice gaining power. You traded me for the settlement of Father's gambling debts without a thought for my comfort, my safety, or my future. And now you appear at my door expecting what exactly? Gratitude, reconciliation, additional financial support? Juliana, her father said sharply, you forget yourself. Whatever our differences, we are still your family. No. Ellis' voice cut through the room like a blade. You are not her family. Family does not treat its members as bargaining chips. Family does not dismiss its daughters as worthless because they are not beautiful enough to attract advantageous matches. Family does not arrive unannounced to assess whether their discarded relation might be manipulated further. He moved to stand beside Juliana, his hand coming to rest at the small of her back in a gesture of unmistakable support. The Duchess of Huntington has found her family here, with those who recognise her worth. You are guests and barely tolerated ones at that. Say what you came to say, and then leave. Lady Graves' mouth opened and closed several times before she managed to speak. We had heard that the Marchioness of Daventry is hosting a ball next month. It would be appropriate for Juliana to attend, to show society that the Duchess of Huntington is not a recluse like her husband. And of course, as her sisters, Lucinda and Vivian, would naturally accompany. No, Juliana said, the word falling like a stone into still water. I will not parade myself at society functions to enhance your daughter's marriage prospects. I will not pretend that we are a loving family when we have never been anything of the sort. And I will not allow you to use my position as Duchess to repair the damage your own actions have caused to your standing. Vivian stepped forward, her dark eyes flashing with spite. You forget yourself, Juliana. You may be a duchess now, but you are still the plain, boring youngest sister no one wanted. You think because a scarred monster was desperate enough to— Enough. Ellis' voice cracked like thunder, silencing Vivian mid-sentence. You will not speak of my wife in such terms. You will not speak at all, unless it is to apologise for the years of neglect and cruelty you have inflicted upon her. And you will remove yourselves from my house immediately. Baron Graves drew himself up, attempting to salvage some dignity. Your Grace, surely we can discuss this like reasonable— There is nothing to discuss. You sold me your daughter because you deemed her worthless. You were wrong. She is the most remarkable woman I have ever encountered, and I thank God daily that your blindness and greed brought her to me. Now get out of my house before I have you escorted out by force. The departure of the Graves family was accomplished in stunned silence, their attempts at protest dying in the face of Ellis's implacable fury. Juliana watched them go from the window of the blue drawing room, her heart pounding with a mixture of exhilaration and residual pain. When their carriage had disappeared down the long drive, she turned to find Ellis watching her with an expression of such tenderness that it stole her breath. I apologise, he said quietly. I should not have spoken for you. It was your confrontation to manage, and You defended me, Juliana interrupted, crossing to stand before him. "No one has ever defended me, Ellis. Not once in my entire life has anyone stood beside me and told my family they were wrong about me." She reached up to touch his face, her palm fitting now familiar against the scarred terrain of his cheek. "Thank you." His hand rose to cover hers, pressing it more firmly against his skin. "They were monstrous," he said, his voice rough with lingering anger. "How did you survive them with your spirit intact? How did you become the woman you are despite their constant diminishment?" "I built walls," Juliana said softly. "I created a fortress inside myself where their words could not reach. I told myself that their blindness was their failure, not mine. And I waited, though I did not know I was waiting, for someone to see past those walls to who I truly was." Ellis's gaze held hers, intense and searching. "I see you," he said simply. "I see you, Juliana." When he kissed her, it felt like the culmination of everything she had ever hoped for and never dared to expect. His lips were gentle against hers, tentative at first, as though he expected her to pull away. Instead, she leaned into him, her hands sliding up to cradle his face, both the smooth side and the scarred, holding him as though he were precious because he was. "I love you," she whispered against his mouth. "I did not expect to. I did not think myself capable of such feeling. But I love you, Ellis. All of you. And I am glad beyond measure that my family's cruelty brought me to you." His arms tightened around her, drawing her closer until she could feel the thunder of his heart against her own. "I love you," he replied, the words seeming to cost him something precious to speak aloud. "I thought myself beyond such vulnerability. I thought the war had burned away everything soft inside me. But you, Juliana, you have rebuilt what I thought was lost forever." They stood together in the blue drawing room as the afternoon light faded. Two people who had been broken in different ways by the cruelties of the world, now whole in each other's arms. The Marchioness of Daventry's spring ball was the event of the season, and all of London was buzzing with anticipation. The grand ballroom of Daventry House blazed with the light of 1,000 candles, the cream of society swirling across the polished floor in a kaleidoscope of silk and jewels. None of them expected the Duke of Huntington to attend. He had not appeared at a society function in 5 years, not since his return from the war, scarred and changed, to bury himself in his northern estate. The invitations were sent each season out of courtesy and duty, but no one truly anticipated they would be accepted. So when the Duke and Duchess of Huntington were announced at the top of the grand staircase, the ballroom fell into a silence so complete that the rustle of Juliana's silver gown seemed to echo. She stood beside Ellis, her hand resting on his arm, her chin held high as she surveyed the sea of astonished faces below. He had offered to wear the mask for this occasion, knowing how society would react to his scars. She had refused on his behalf, informing him that any society worth joining would accept him as he was, and any society that could not was not worth the effort of their attendance. "Ready?" Ellis murmured, low enough that only she could hear. "I have been ready my entire life," Juliana replied, and together they descended into the fray. The whispers began immediately, of course, travelling through the crowd like wildfire. The Duke, my God, his face, she could hear fragments as they passed. And his Duchess, isn't that the plain Graves girl? The youngest one? How extraordinary. I never would have expected. Ellis guided her through the crowd with military precision, his bearing commanding despite the way some guests visibly flinched from his appearance. The few who mattered, the old friends from before the war, the true aristocrats who valued substance over surface, came forward to greet them with genuine warmth. "Huntington," exclaimed Lord Blackwood, one of Ellis's oldest friends, grasping his hand firmly. "About damn time you emerged from that cave of yours. And this must be the Duchess everyone is talking about." He bowed over Juliana's hand with a twinkle in his eye. "Madam, you have accomplished what the entire ton failed to achieve for 5 years. You have brought the bear of Waterloo back into society." "The Duchess accomplished rather more than that," Ellis replied, his hand finding Juliana's and squeezing gently. "She has made life worth living again." The simple declaration, spoken without embarrassment before Lord Blackwood and the dozen guests within earshot, sent a fresh wave of whispers rippling through the ballroom. Juliana felt her cheeks warm with pleasure, but she kept her composure, matching Ellis's directness with her own quiet certainty. As the evening progressed, a subtle shift occurred in the room's atmosphere. Those who had initially recoiled from Ellis's scars began to observe more carefully, noting the obvious devotion between the Duke and his unexpected Duchess, the way his harsh features softened when he looked at her, the way she touched his scarred face with casual affection, as though the damaged skin were no different from any other. "They are very much in love," she overheard Lady Blackwood murmur to another matron. "Whoever would have expected it? The beast of Huntington and the forgotten Graves girl." "Perhaps they recognise something in each other," the other woman replied thoughtfully. "Something the rest of us missed." It was during the supper dance that the true confrontation occurred. Juliana was returning from the refreshment table when she found her path blocked by Lucinda and Vivian, flanking their mother like beautiful, venomous sentinels. "Sister dear," Lucinda said sweetly, though her eyes were hard as diamonds, "we simply had to offer our congratulations. Who could have imagined that our mousy little Juliana would land such a notable catch? Scarred and reclusive, of course, but still a duke." "Indeed," Vivian added, her smile equally false. "It seems desperation works in mysterious ways. The Duke must have been truly starved for company to see anything worthwhile in you." Before Juliana could respond, Ellis appeared at her shoulder, having somehow sensed her distress from across the room. "Ladies Graves," he said, his voice carrying the dangerous softness of a sword being unsheathed. "I believe there has been some confusion about the nature of my regard for my wife." "Your Grace," Lady Graves interjected hastily, "my daughters meant no offence. We are simply delighted to see Juliana so well settled." "Your daughters," Ellis interrupted, his scarred face terrible in its cold fury, "have just demonstrated exactly the kind of behaviour that made your family a laughingstock long before your husband's debts became public knowledge. You mock my wife for being overlooked, yet you are the ones who failed to see her worth. You dismiss her as mousy and worthless, yet she possesses more grace, intelligence, and genuine nobility than both your precious daughters combined." The ballroom had grown very quiet, nearby guests straining to hear every word of this unprecedented set-down. "You sold her to me like livestock," Ellis continued, his voice carrying clearly. "You considered her so beneath value that you never even negotiated terms. You simply threw her at the scarred monster in exchange for a clear ledger, never imagining she might become the treasure you failed to recognise." He drew Juliana close to his side, his arm around her waist, presenting to all of society the image of a united front. "The Duchess of Huntington is the most remarkable woman I have ever encountered. Her intelligence humbles me, her kindness restores me, her love has given me back a life I thought the war had stolen forever, and I will spend the rest of my days ensuring she never again doubts her own extraordinary worth." Juliana felt tears prick at her eyes, not of sorrow but of overwhelming joy. Here, before all of society, her husband was declaring not merely his protection, but his love, his admiration, his complete and unwavering devotion. "Anyone who speaks ill of my wife," Ellis concluded, his gaze sweeping the room to encompass not just the Graves family, but anyone who might consider such foolishness, will find themselves facing the full weight of my displeasure. And I assure you, I learned things during the war that make social ruin seem merciful by comparison." The threat was delivered with such quiet certainty that Juliana saw several guests pale. The Graves women had gone white as sheets, their social credit evaporating like morning mist under the blazing sun of the Duke's fury. "Come, my love," Ellis said, turning his attention to Juliana with an expression of such tenderness it seemed impossible on his scarred face. "I believe they are striking up a waltz, and I find I have an overwhelming desire to dance with my wife." He led her onto the floor, and the crowd parted before them like the Red Sea before Moses. As Ellis drew her into his arms, as the music swelled around them, Juliana felt a peace settle into her bones that she had never known before. She was seen. She was loved. She was valued. "Thank you," she whispered as they swept across the floor, his lead sure and strong despite the limp that still plagued him from his war wounds. "For what you said, for standing beside me, for all of it." "I spoke only the truth," Ellis replied, his gaze holding hers with an intensity that made the crowded ballroom disappear until there was only the two of them spinning in their private universe. "You have saved me, Juliana. Not from my scars or my nightmares or my demons, but from the certainty that I would face them alone forever. You looked at me and saw a man worth loving when I had long since decided I was only worth pitying. How could I do less for you?" "Neither of us expected to be saved," Juliana murmured, her hand tightening on his shoulder. "I thought I would simply survive, endure, exist in whatever corner I was assigned. I never imagined I would be truly happy." "Nor did I," Ellis admitted. "I thought happiness was something that had been burned away on the battlefield along with half my face. I thought the best I could hope for was a quiet coexistence with someone too broken or desperate to expect more. Instead, I found you." The waltz drew to a close, but Ellis did not release her. Instead, here in the centre of the ballroom with all of society watching, he bent his scarred face to hers and kissed her with a tenderness that made several matrons reach for their handkerchiefs. When they parted, Juliana was flushed with happiness, her eyes bright with unshed tears. The guests around them had begun to applaud, softly at first, then with growing enthusiasm, as though witnessing a love story was exactly what the jaded ton had been craving without knowing it. "The Duke and Duchess of Huntington," someone declared, raising a glass in toast. "Long may they prosper." The cry was taken up around the room, and Juliana found herself surrounded by well-wishers, society matrons who now claimed to have always known she was a diamond in the rough, gentlemen who praised Ellis's wisdom in choosing substance over surface. Whether their sudden approval was genuine or merely fashionable, she could not bring herself to care. She had what mattered. She had Ellis and he had her, and together they had built something neither had dared to dream was possible, a love story written not in the first flush of youth and beauty, but in the deeper, richer ink of two wounded souls who had recognized themselves in each other. Later that night, as their carriage rolled through the London streets toward the Huntington townhouse, Ellis pulled Juliana close, her head resting on his shoulder as the city lights flickered past. "Happy?" he asked quietly, his lips brushing her temple. "More than I ever imagined possible," she replied truthfully. "You know, I used to watch balls like that from the corners, invisible and overlooked. I would tell myself that happiness was for other people, prettier people, more important people. I thought the best I could hope for was simply not being noticed, because being noticed meant being dismissed." Ellis's arm tightened around her. "And now I understand that being truly seen, being loved for exactly who you are, is worth more than all the admiration in the world. I would rather have your honest regard than the false flattery of 1,000 ballrooms." He tilted her face up to his scarred features beautiful to her now, a map of everything he had survived and everything they had become together. "You have my honest regard for the rest of my life," he promised. "You have my love, my devotion, and my solemn vow that you will never be invisible again. Not to me, not to the world, not even to yourself." When he kissed her, Juliana felt the last of her old walls crumble away, leaving only the certainty of his arms around her and the promise of a future neither of them had expected, but both had been waiting for their entire lives. The forgotten sister and the scarred Duke, two broken pieces that had somehow fit together to make something whole and beautiful and true. They had not expected to be saved, but saved they were by each other, in the quiet way that matters most.